Hello, good
Okay,
morning. Today our guest is Jutta Bolt. Hello, Jutta. How are you doing?
good, thanks. How are you?
I'm great, Jutta. So, people, this is Jutta Bolt. And for those of you who do not know, Jutta is a pioneer in economic research. She produced the first paper on the impact of indigenous slavery in Africa. Jutta has done tremendous work on the relationship between pre-colonial institutions and modern development in Africa. Jutta has done work on the long-term history of Africa. Jutta has studied colonialism. She is one of my favorite scholars. Yeah, yes, I just love your work, Jucha, and I'm usually not this passionate. So we're going to be talking about a paper you did some years ago on export slavery in Africa, and then we're going to discuss the second paper on indigenous slavery in Africa. So you can go ahead and tell us about the first paper on export slavery in Africa.
So I'm sure that you meant my. So I have a paper on indigenous slavery
Yes.
in Africa, which responds to Nunn's paper, Nathan Nunn's paper on export slavery, actually, and the other paper is on institutions or indigenous institutions under colonial rule. So these two papers, which paper would you like me to start on?
The indigenous paper, Juta.
Okay, so the indigenous slavery paper. So there has been this already a few years ago, but then there was at the time was a lot of attention on how the exports of slaves or slave-made people from Africa to other parts of the world, actually underdeveloped African countries, and what of course has been tested in various studies, and we sort of tell the other story that is part of slavery in Africa, and that is more the institution of indigenous slavery, so indigenous slave systems. So this was much less of exporting people away from Africa, but actually sort of having people within African societies that were performing forced labor. That was various kinds of forced labor. So sometimes it was very harsh systems, but sometimes it was also more labor related to domestic chores, for example. And these people were eventually often integrated into the society that they worked for. And then we try to sort of understand whether that has a long-term effect on how African countries developed, mostly in terms of economic development. And we find that in those countries that had more societies that had the institution of indigenous slavery, so that had institutions that actually excluded people from being free and being free to choose to do what they wanted, that this is linked to lower long-term incomes, so incomes measured today or after the colonial periods or after 1950.
Yes.
And sorry.
You may go ahead. I thought you were finished, but you may go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So, and the channel that we find, because there's of course the question, so how is that possible? Because we find the effect becomes stronger after a few decades after independence, and we argue that this is because after independence, societies had to develop independent state structures and developmental state structures, and we argue that if countries had larger sections of society being excluded or being recognized as from a slave society, then this impeded the formation of strong developmental state structures. So that would be then the mechanism.
Yes, and Jutta, I would like to cite an excerpt from your paper, and this paper is titled Export Slavery, Indigenous Slavery, and Long-Term Growth in Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, let me be more simplistic. With a sample average of 52.7 years of life expectancy, this works out at between 2.0 and 3.9 years lower life expectancy on average in our sample. You argue, Jutta, that slavery in the 19th century is robustly associated with lower life expectancy and also worse health outcomes and diminished human capital. Tell us a little bit about this area of research.
I'm not sure that you could actually sort of set this, but or sort of post this, but I don't think we have in this paper we have life expectancy.
Yeah, because
in this.
Jutta, you did two versions of the paper. They're similar. They're similar. So I'm looking at a different version.
Oh, you have the
Yeah.
earlier
Yes.
version.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So I didn't have that at the top of my mind. Sorry.
But both versions are equally similar. It's just that some of the data are a bit different.
Yeah, but I don't have the life expectancy paper here, so I can't remember that we
that's
included that.
Okay, that's okay. But in both papers, you make the same point that slave societies are not open access systems; they are limited systems. So you're using the Northian model to argue that because slave societies promote income inequality, some groups will automatically end up in a worse position relative to those who are more powerful.
Yes. Yeah, that's so that is indeed sort of as I tried to explain the link that we see from earlier or from an early point in time, so say beginning of the 20th century or even before, towards the effects on long-term developments measured as outcomes in terms of income or social developments today, and that is that it sort of affects how you organize societies and how inclusive your societies are, and how the gains from growth are distributed over societies. And the argument is that when you have societies that actually exclude people from these broader developments, it is linked to lower average overall developments in terms of GDP per capita. That's how we measure it, but it could also be related to lower social developments in terms of education or health outcomes.
Yeah, and Jutta, I don't know if you are aware, but I'm really interested in African history. And even in the 1980s in northern Nigeria, people who were enslaved under the Sokoto Caliphate, they still encounter discrimination. So the long run,
exactly. No, so yeah, let me just confirm that I think this is true, and we see it in Mauritius, for example, as well. And I am working with a researcher from Ethiopia, and there are just clear signs that even up until today, people are being recognized as coming from a society that practiced slavery or actually had maybe slaves working for them, even if that was historically the case. So I think these could all these are all points that sort of prove the point that there are some historical phenomena potentially that have very long and strong and lasting, persistent effects up until today. There's also a paper on trust, for example, so that slavery systems are related to how people trust others within the country. So I think there are clear signals, even though we can't always measure it directly, that there are historical factors that have long-term implications.
Well, Jutta, one of the reasons why I appreciate your research is that you explore obvious topics that other people tend to shy away from. As a student of history, I can tell you that several books have been written on indigenous slavery in Africa. Books describe the different types of slavery. Some books argue that though in Africa, slaves were incorporated into the broader kinship structures, the norm in Africa at the time was that a slave was still viewed as an outsider. So the state of slavery in Africa was not romantic. There are examples of slaves being sacrificed. Some places in Africa had slave villages, and these people were treated like slaves, but they had a greater degree of freedom than chattel slaves. They lived in the village, and they were bonded to the village in a sense, but the structure was a bit more sophisticated. So they were like slaves, but not really slaves. So when I discovered their research some time ago, I said, my God, Jutta is always surprising because this is a topic that we should study more intently. So this point
Yes.
is a bit tangential, but Jutta, why is there hesitancy to study this issue?
Well, because it's of course, I mean, I think, I'm just going to confirm one of the points that you made. So, it's often known as a more benign sort of slavery system within Africa, but I think there's also a lot of research that shows there's a wide distribution towards, more benign systems, maybe at some hand, but there were also societies that practiced much more harsh slavery systems. And I think why has this not received much attention, or why is this a bit of a sensitive issue? It's always a sensitive issue if you're confronted with parts of your history that are maybe less positive to some extent. And I think this goes for any society that has practiced slavery, or have maybe used people as not as people, but maybe as
chattel.
As chattel. Then that is something that you might be ashamed of, and it's not something you would like to be confronted with. But I think many societies, the Dutch are very prominent in this.
Exactly, Jutta. No, I'm going to stop you, Jutta. The Dutch people talk about Dutch slavery and British slavery, but they don't talk about African slavery. I think slavery is pernicious, even if it's practiced by non-Europeans. Writing articles on Dutch slavery is not a problem. I am tired of these articles. They talk about the British colonialism, but when it comes to studying Africans and slavery, my God, people don't have brains anymore.
No, it's of course also tricky. I think we should raise awareness of this, and I think the way forward of sort of getting this more accepted is actually doing. And there are already a number of excellent books on slavery within Africa, or African slave systems, and I think we should do more of those and more detailed studies of, okay, so how did this exactly work within societies, and what are long-term consequences of these systems within African societies. And I think, I have a very early paper which sort of touches on the subject, but I think much more can be done, because knowledge also creates maybe understanding of, okay, so this is how it worked. Maybe we're not very proud, or maybe there are long-term negative consequences, but this is what it is, and it helps us understand where societies are today. So I think it's very important that we actually get more people interested in this and understanding what happened.
Yeah, and what's also interesting in the paper that you're looking at, Indigenous slavery in Africa, is that you look at the relationship between Indigenous slavery and institutions. And I have many questions, but just give us a brief overview before I begin to ask the questions.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so I want you to give us a brief overview of the relationship between Indigenous slavery and institution before I begin to ask questions, because I have several questions, but I want to create an opportunity for the audience to gain some appreciation of the research.
Okay, so that is basically the mechanism, right, that we look at in the paper, is where we say so we look at a very rough, I have to admit, so this is also something should look more into, very rough measure of the prevalence of Indigenous slavery, and then we link that to institutional development through the North and Weingast framework of open societies, where where the link is between, if you have societies that have features that sort of include sections of societies, that will sort of breed institutions that are more closed, that are less democratic, that are less accountable, than if you have traditions of inclusive early sort of institutions.
Yes, Jutta. So this is one of my first questions. In your article, you look at the nexus between slavery and property rights, and I would like to know, how did the system of indigenous slavery affect property rights?
Um, I think there are, of course, a lot of sort of links. So if there were systems of, and of course you have to define, what are property rights. But I think there is a large variation in terms of property rights early in Africa and maybe today also across the world. But slavery is, of course, is defined as a legal institution of using persons as property. So that is a property right. I think that's very well studied and also well understood. There's a consensus view that in history in Africa, there wasn't always clear defined property rights in terms of land, for example, but there was in these societies, there was a very clear defined property right, but that was in humans. And one of the reasons was that these were very sparsely populated areas where people could move away easily. And if you, one way of sort of getting people to work for you is to bond them and to bind them to basically the land to be able to use their labor. So I think that is basically how it's linked to early property rights. We haven't sort of established a long-term relation to private property rights today in Africa, but that could be one of the reason, or sort of one of the future lines of research, I think.
Yes, and Jutta, in your article, you give the example of a group in the Babwa people. So you write the Babwa of Congo are described to have a significant concentration of slaves, where slavery was not hereditary, but where the children of slaves retained an inferior social status. And I'm making reference to this point because those of us who are not truly familiar with the literature on slavery in Africa often incorrectly argue that in Africa slavery was really hereditary, though this is not the case. In the Asante Empire, for example, people could inherit the status of a slave, and as you rightly said in this piece, even when people were not compelled to become slaves, their parents were slaves, they were still treated as inferior individuals. And I think this point is important, Jutta, because we can go back to what you said earlier. If you're viewed and treated as an inferior person, you cannot innovate. So this is the question, Jutta, and you are yet to study it. I have not seen a study on the issue, but there's a relationship between slavery and innovation. Had it not been for slavery in Africa or America or anywhere else, would people be more likely to innovate?
Yeah, so I think again, let me stress that there is no simple sort of representation of early or indigenous slave systems. So yes, in some instances, children of slaves were actually free, but in various other instances, children of slaves were actually being in a similar institution and so became slaves themselves, and anything sort of in between. It's not always clear that so obviously if you are still going to be a slave, if your parents are slaves, then that allows less freedom to explore all of your talents. If you, however, become a free man, even though your parents were slaves, I'm not sure that there's going to be such a long-term link towards longer-term developments in terms of innovation or whatever. If there's sort of if that link is clearly broken. But yes, as long as I think it goes for broader developments in society, as long as you have people that are being recognized as stemming from slave families and are therefore inferior, cannot reach their full potential.
Yes, and Jutta, one of the reasons why I appreciate your paper is that it is strong on empirical data, but you furnish a litany of qualitative studies. And I'm going to share another excerpt. Jutta, you don't have a problem if I upload this to YouTube. Not sorry, not upload it to YouTube, upload it to my channel. So put it in the link so that people can read it.
No, of course, that's
Yes.
fine. So that's going to be the World Development Paper, I'm assuming. Or
we're still on the same paper because the paper we did on slavery is very comprehensive, so we're still on that paper. So and I'm going to cite this excerpt. Within the Igbo societies, the slaves and their descendants remained a clearly defined element in society well into the second half of the 20th century, and their general positions did not change even though the government in the 1950s prohibited their use as a labor force. Can you imagine the development they would have achieved if those people were properly integrated into society? And this is fairly recent, the 1950s, that's just what, over 60 years ago.
Yeah, that is I think that is one of the things sort of that this research has shown showed me at least. I've learned a lot from this because it's so, we tend to think of some of these practices as ancient and long ago, but if it's in the 1950s, if it's so prominent, then we still have children of people that were in that situation, right? Or maybe even those people are still alive. If my parents would still be here, I mean, they're from the 1940s. So so I think it is so recent and it's so clear. And this, of course, warrants an understanding of this pattern, sort of to understand how historical structures affect societies today. And this would be a very good example of how this sort of continues to affect.
And you also list the example of Mauritania. You said that chattel slavery was officially abolished only in 1918. And again, Jutta, in your paper, you cite the research of Bruce I. Saker Dodd, and he did a study on African Americans, and he said that it took several generations for the descendants of the enslaved to achieve parity with people who had attained slavery several generations earlier. So I'm thinking about the Bruce research, and I'm saying maybe this could also be the same for Africa, in the sense that there is a disparity in human capital between those who are not enslaved, and those whose descendants were enslaved. So this is another interesting area of research for you, Jutta. I like to give scholars homework.
Yeah, no, I think so. This is something, and of course, I mean, what I think should move away from is saying, okay, so there were indigenous cis or African slave systems somewhere in the 20th century, or maybe in the 19th century, or even before, and that is going to affect long-term outcomes forever. So there's going to be persistence forever. These things change, right? So
yes,
it's gonna, and it could go either way. So we have made the claim that it didn't affect societies or countries straight after independence, but it took a while because the mechanism is state development and inclusive states along the Northern Weingast thesis. But this is also, it's not always in that direction. So at some point, these effects might change and either peter out, or people that have been treated as inferior or sort of are carrying the burden of being a slave descendant might actually organize themselves, start speaking up for themselves, and that might actually change society. Or it might be a societal sort of revelation in the sense of towards more equality and trying to develop in various aspects a more inclusive society that allows people, whatever their backgrounds and whatever their beliefs, to actually fully participate. But I think this is a much broader sort of societal question, societal development. So I think what is, I mean, we can still sort of see the remnants of those early societal sort of frameworks, but it is not that this is destiny or is going to set countries or people on a path towards a clear defined end goal. So there are lots of factors that might actually change things. And I think one of the most important is that we raise awareness and that we are open for change and try to work towards more inclusive societies. And this also goes for societies that I've studied in the paper, I think.
And again, Jutta, your point is so nuanced. Yes, there might be long-term implications of slavery, but societies are not enslaved to the past. And this is one of my objections to the deep roots of development literature. There's the assumption that it is really difficult for societies to move beyond the past, and that is not true. Societies can evolve.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. So I think whether or not it's difficult, that also differs for different societies. But I think it is not that development is destiny. So there are different routes to an end goal, and it depends on how societies are organized and the people that live in them basically organize this society, right? So they also have a way of changing where their society is going. And I think if we study the effect of early factors on long-term development, that is not to say, okay, you were close to the coast, or you were in a society that had slavery, or you were in a society that practiced slavery, and therefore this is going to be your long-term outcome. No, it means it is supposed to show, okay, so historical factors have a strong and lasting effect, but they're not stagnant, or definitely not always stagnant. And there's definitely, if we study societal developments, it raises awareness of, oh, look, these structures are in the way they are because of some kind of historical process, but it doesn't mean that we cannot change. But if you are aware of certain phenomena, this also gives you an opportunity to change or to reorganize things that you do not appreciate in societies or in economies.
All right, Jutta.
That's what our research should show. Yeah.
And in your article, you asked a very important question. These societies that are poor today because of indigenous slavery, were they always poor?
Yeah.
Yes. What are your findings?
I think so this is much more, so this is not something that if we were they always poor, what we measure is basically incomes from 1950 onwards, so post-independence. So my answer is going to be focused first on that, and then I'm going to paint a broader picture also for the historical period, but that is not on my own research. But I think what we show is that incomes in 1950 for the different countries in Africa and income, say, in 1990 or 2000 are not always highly correlated. So it's not that if countries are very poor in 1950, all the same countries are going to be relatively poor in 2000. So these things change over time. And I think a very important point to stress is that, and I said this before, that poverty is not destiny. I take this quote from a colleague who used this before, but I think African countries are not incapable of growing in terms of economic expansion. So I think there is more recent research that actually shows that there's been substantial increases in incomes in historical periods for various African regions, also experienced rapid economic growth, but so far many African countries have also experienced periods of busts. So it's very volatile. So they have experienced economic expansion and then declines. And I think the trick of experiencing substantial economic progress is to try and avoid these declines or these busts. So to make the system a little bit more resistant and more stable. So I think it's definitely not true that these countries or regions that I've studied have always been poor.
Yes, and you refer to Nathan Nunn, and I quote, he finds that it were the richer, not the poorer countries that selected into the slave trade.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a finding of Nathan, and was done some interesting research on the slave trade. But Jutta, in your
yeah.
response, you made an important point. Martin Jervin, he's doing some really fascinating research on economic growth in Africa. And what he's revealing is that economic growth in Africa is not really unusual if we measure or data properly. I do respect the research of Martin Jervin, and I plan to have him as a guest on the show at some point. But I think what Martin and maybe and other scholars should do is look at the relationship between Smithian and Schumpeterian growth in Africa. Maybe African growth is still at the base level. It's output driven growth, not necessarily innovation driven growth. And this is one of the reasons why in Africa, rapid economic growth is not necessarily correlated with a major increase in quality of life indicators. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think, well, these are two separate questions, but I
Yes.
think one of the, you might be, I mean, it's very clear that African growth has been often associated with rising commodity prices or resource prices and increases in trade of primary products, right? And it has not transformed into structural transformation, so people moving out of the primary sector into a more productive industrial sector or more productive services, and therefore cannot be qualified as Kuznets' modern economic growth. So we see very little transformation of the underlying economy, I think. And this is, of course, if your economy is so focused or specialized in a certain set of products and so dependent on world market prices for those products, your economy is going to be very sensitive to changes in the prices of those commodities. And I think this is clearly what we've seen in Africa. So after independence, we see rising exports of primary commodities. We see the world market booming. We see prices for these primary products increasing, and we see substantial economic development in various African countries. But as soon as the world hits the oil crisis, or the oil crisis hits the world, we actually see a stark reversal in world trade, world prices, and therefore also in African development, I think. So that is one side. So these economies are fragile in that extent, and I think there's increasing research. Danny Roderick, for example, but also colleagues in the University of Groningen show that structural transformation is not happening. So people are not moving towards more productive employment or more productive work out of the primary sector. Does that necessarily mean that social development is also hampered? Yes, in the sense of that if countries have less incomes, it's harder to pay for schooling, for example, for healthcare, for infrastructure. But at the same time, we do see substantial increases, I think, in social indicators for various African countries. I mean, they're not at the level of where we would like them to be. So clearly, there is still too limited access to healthcare. Not all kids are enrolled in school. We see especially rural children being left out often. But we do see also improvements. So if you chart social indicators since 1950 up until today, we do see improvement in that respect. To the extent, of course, that is externally financed by aid, for example. That means that the economy itself cannot pay for it. That is, of course, a sign that's not a good sign. You would like countries to be able to pay and finance their own social development. On the other hand, if you have a more highly educated and healthier population, that could also then in turn stimulate more broad-based developments in well-being and welfare. So I think it's not all bad in that respect, but we would like to see more embedded, broader sort of developments across the African continent.
Jutta, this paper is awesome. You cover immense data. Well, you are the economist. You did the research. I'm a layman, but as a layman, I can tell you, I really love the paper, and I'm going to talk about it for a few more minutes before we transition to the other paper. But the information is just awesome. And instead of asking, I'm on page 25, and the question I'm going to ask is this: how much income development did it cost the continent? And feel free to talk as long as you want.
Sorry, can you rephrase that question?
How much income development? How much income development did it cost the continent? I'm talking about indigenous slavery on page 25.
That's a very good question. I think I actually have a different. I have the original version, which goes from page 148 to something. So I'm not sure what page you are on. I think we make some of that predictions in the paper, right?
Yes, you do. And I believe I may have the similar version, but you're right. If we take the typical variation in the indigenous slavery variable, the standard variation of 0.35 around the sample average of 0.63, and this is in a bracket, and apply the OLS coefficient, this translates into a decline of 26% in year 2000 per capita GDP compared to the actual level. For a one standard deviation increase in export slavery, the income decline is 39%. I'm on that page.
Yes. Okay. So I think, I think I'm on the same page. So.
You're the economist, so break down the data for us here. Break down the data for us. That's what I really want.
Yeah. So what you want is, sorry?
Yeah, because you're the economist, I want you to shed more light on the data. I can only cite the numbers, but you have more knowledge.
Oh yeah. So I think, this is, of course, if we trust the estimation. So this is a statistical sort of method to sort of show what does sort of, the data show us in terms of real implications for long run economic growth. And if we sort of, what we do is we estimate the effects of early or indigenous slavery systems on income estimates today, and we find a coefficient that sort of implies that that we sort of, that if we look at the 2000 year, in the GDP per capita in 2008, and we sort of rank countries from rich to poor, they could have been sort of, their incomes could have been 30% higher on average than they were in 2008 had they not had that system of slavery. Of course, everything equal. So then everything else that we sort of measure or we assume in this system remains unchanged. We just remove the indigenous slavery. And that's, of course, a little bit unrealistic, but it does go to show that some of these sort of historical factors can have a very strong effect. If we would look sort of what does that mean in terms of average growth rates, it basically means the average growth between 1950 and 2008 was 1% per year, and therefore slavery sort of set these countries back 24 years in this, if we use this average growth rate for these 58, 60 years. So in that sense, you can see that such a system can have a substantial real economic effect. But again, let me say that this is a statistical sort of method, and it's not, I mean, it assumes that everything else remains equal.
Yes, Jutta, I'm I'm sure that you meet people all the time, Jutta, and if they want to impress you, they may refer to your research, but I actually read your papers.
You made that very clear, I think,
Yeah,
today.
yes, I actually read your papers. And for me, Jutta, I think it's pretentious to invite an academic and to not read his or her papers. That doesn't make much sense. And
So you're very
Jutta,
well prepared.
yeah, Jutta, in your article, you also mentioned the Ashanti Empire. What was the Ashanti Empire? It was extractive according to Purby, and I've also read Purby. So there's an argument that colonialism resulted in extractive institutions, but before colonialism, institutions in Africa were already extractive.
Well, it depends on what you call extractive. In a sense, it was not taken out of Africa, right? So the Ashanti kept it within their empire. I have to say, I'm not an Ashanti expert, but these are a number of these sort of bigger empires or bigger states in Africa prior to the colonial period. We do see a clear hierarchy in how these societies are organized, and some of these empires actually stand on the fundament of slave labor. So they raid sort of or subdue neighboring societies or tribes, and they use some of those labor to sort of build an army, for example, but also to work the land and provide all sorts of other labor for their state structures. And also, these slaves and other societies were used as a tribute system.
Yes.
To get economic and administrative contributions for their slave system. So in that sense, I mean, is that it's not extractive in the sense that it was used in the literature often, because it also built a society, right? It did not just extract and just left everything collapsed.
Yeah. Well, Jutta, I do agree with your assumptions. The Ashanti Empire and the Dahomey Empire, they represented earlier models of state development in Africa. But one scholar, Ivor Wilkes, he referred to the Ashanti Empire as mercantilist. If we judge the economic policies of these empires in Africa and compare them to European and Asian empires, they are also extractive. So for me, when I'm approaching history, I just use one perspective. If the policies of the Ashanti Empire meet the criteria for extraction, I call them extraction. And the truth is that many groups in Africa actually resented the rise of Ashanti. As a researcher, I am dispassionate. I just see numbers and data. I'm very cool. That's just me. So you did a study on colonialism, and you argue that colonialism produced some positive indirect consequences. That study is not a part of this interview, but I read it. You did a study with Dirk Berzimer some years ago. It's not a part of the interview, but I remember that study, and you did say that colonialism resulted in quality institutions, and these institutions, they left a favorable impact on development in some areas. So when
I said is so we addressed the sort of what did Europeans bring.
Yeah.
And we said instead of their institutions, when they settled in Africa, what they brought was their human capital and institutions that sort of reproduced human capital. So they established formal schools. So we sort of link European colonization to some extent to human capital development, and we say that in those areas where more of these institutions were set up, we still see today more students enrolled and higher literacy rates in Africa. So in that sense, there's a positive link between the colonial period and today, but it's not to say that colonialism brought or had positive effects.
But
in this.
yeah, colonialism, due to properly understood, is a system of extraction. The purpose of colonialism is to extract wealth, not to develop countries. If a country records an increase in the literacy rate because of colonialism, this is just an indirect effect. And again, when we're studying history, we ought to be dispassionate. Study colonialism as a bad model that in some rare cases can produce positive effects. So for example, some have argued that Japanese colonialism had a positive effect on South Korea. This does not suggest that colonialism is good, but give give people very due when they produce positive effects. That's my broader point. I just don't have the time to engage in mudslinging or presentism. Our society is very different from the society even 20 or 30 years ago. So we cannot judge historical figures using our standard. That's just silly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have time for that. I'm gonna be politically incorrect. Sorry. Yeah, I don't have time for that. I see people as people, and this is how we should approach life. But
I
Jutta,
completely agree.
yeah, I tell you, this paper is just so amazing. I read it, I like it, and we're going to wrap up because I really want to talk briefly about your paper titled "Oh, African Shape British Colonial Institutions: Evidence
Yeah.
from Local Taxation." So this will be the last snippet that I'm going to read from this paper. Africa's pervasive slavery practices implied discrimination and social exclusion of large population groups. Even even in even in the most benign view, indigenous slaves were still marginalized members of society with few social linkages to free men and women. This was often perpetuated as after the abolition of slavery, ex-slaves often remained in relations of dependence and exploitation. However, Jutta, as expected, you are a very balanced researcher, so you also write former slaves in Igbo society not take part, for example, not take part in councils. But then again, there are also examples in Africa where slaves served as soldiers and diplomats. So the point of me reading this is to not romanticize slavery in Africa, but to be realistic. It was a negative system, but some slaves were also elevated based on their relationship with the elites. That's just reality.
Yeah, that is reality, and I think that's also that is a nice sort of rounding off of this story. I think we started also sort of acknowledging that we should understand this system in more detail. So instead of this cross-country approach, maybe look into country experiences, because we see such a large variation between different societies. So indeed, in some societies, slaves or descendants from slaves did not only became free, but actually rose also in the elites of those societies, or in the administration of those societies. Said before, the Ashanti is a very prominent example where slaves were, soldiers defending sort of their state. So I think they obtained different roles in different societies, and I think that's very important to realize.
All right, so we're going to talk about the paper, "Oh, African Shaped British Colonial Institutions." And Jutta, in this paper, you gave the joke where an academic said, "Who ruled institutions during colonialism?" And the answer is Africans. I don't know if you remember that joke. But Jutta, during the colonial era, were Africans passive agents or active agents?
During the colonial period, you
Yeah,
mean? So
yeah,
in
yeah,
ruling here, yeah.
yeah.
Well, of course, again, a lot of variation, but I think we have to realize that. So now, sort of the question sort of implies, were they active agents in terms of colonial rule? If you think about how many, and I'm just going to focus now on British Africa and the four countries in the study, how many British people actually went towards Africa and settled there. These were not enough to rule these vast territories. These were not enough to, be in charge of everything. So this is why, we know of the phenomenon indirect rule. So especially the British were known for this, but the French also, of course, applied this. They needed people to work with to actually get a society, at least to some extent, organized. And what we see is actually that for this, the British used institutions that were in place, local level institutions that were in place in the various countries. So in that sense, they were active, Africans were active agents in ruling themselves. Were they also, but that is something different than did they side or co-opt with colonial rule to set up, these countries, these nation states, and were they active agents in, what is often framed as extractive authorities or extractive governments. I think that is much less so the case. So they were active agents in ruling the rural societies that they had been ruling before, and they played a role in sort of organizing smaller scales of decentralized populations.
Yes, and in your research, Jutta, you also said a scholar called Thomas Peirce, and he said that during the period of colonialism, Africans were actually quite powerful, and often the Europeans were co-opted by Africans, in the sense that Africans were oppressed to an extent, but elite Africans had a say in how their societies were managed. And you give several examples in your paper, and I'm just making this point because it is often asserted in the mainstream media and popular media for people who are not academics that during the period of colonization, Europeans invaded Africa and Africans were oppressed. This narrative is partially true, but the evidence and the research actually shows that many Africans resisted due to, so for example, the Igbos, they're a good example of Africans who resisted, and some Africans, for political reasons, had to form relationships with Europeans. If they did not, they would have this would have resulted in diminished status. So again, the narrative of colonialism is more intricate and complicated than we usually assume.
Exactly. I think this is exactly what this paper tries to speak towards, is that we assume, that basically two sort of strands of literature. One says colonial rule or colonial authorities came there, or European powers came there and established countries as they wanted and just used it as resources, extracted everything they needed. Or the other view would be, and this is very simplistic, of course, colonial rule only brought few Europeans, they had very little power. They set up extractive states, but the European colonial rule lasted relatively short in Africa, so it was a brief period, and therefore they did not affect pre-colonial institutions, and therefore they remained unchanged. But I think this paper actually tries to speak to a middle ground in this debate and say, okay, there were Africans living there, they had organized very often decentralized societies. There was a lot of accountability often in these societies, we try to argue. And then Europeans and Africans sort of made so African institutions or African societies were integrated into colonial rule in various ways, but it was definitely not that one part of that one side of this group. So just the Europeans ruled or determined everything that was happening. I think Africans were very powerful, and some elites co-opted and sort of misused maybe powers that were granted to them under colonial rule. But in the far majority, we find that actually much of these institutions remained intact. Much of African decentralized institutions remained intact and remained a powerful voice and a powerful way of organizing these societies. And yes, some aspects were adapted because situation had changed under colonial rule, because nation states were created and there was now a colonial authority, and this happened in various ways, but Africans these institutions, these African institutions, remained very robust throughout the colonial period.
Yes. Jutta, whenever I read one of your studies, I am impressed. And we're wrapping up the interview, but you have also produced several other papers on Botswana and Africa, and you have an excellent co-author, Lee Gardner. Is that her name?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
you
Lee
yeah,
Gardner.
yeah,
Yeah,
Lee.
she's
So
excellent. Yeah.
yes, and I plan to have her on the show. I'm going to invite her.
You should. You
Yeah,
should.
I'm
She
going
has
to
lots to talk about.
yeah, I'm going to invite her. But Jutta, for a long time, I've been speaking to people about your research, and I usually ask them, is there a relationship between exogamy and development? And I'm referring to this question because in your paper on the pre-colonial institutions in Botswana, this is not a topic that you actually empirically tested, but you implied that there could be a relationship between exogamy and development in the sense that people who are more likely to marry outside of their immediate kin group,
Yeah.
they usually develop greater skills. So and as a result, groups that practice exogamy can be more innovative. You hinted at this in your research. It was never tested empirically, but you
No.
hinted at it. What's your opinion?
Yeah, so I think there are various stands to this debate, and one of the tricks is, of course, to fully understand how that mechanism would potentially work. But as with slavery, I mean, there's a big variance in how these specific structures work. So I think in some cases it could actually be related to positive outcomes in the
Yeah,
sense of, stimulating innovation. It makes you more more
more
flexible,
open. Yeah,
adapting to different circumstances. Sorry.
it makes you more open to ideas.
Yeah, perhaps, or yeah, open to ideas, but also allows you to adapt to different circumstances more easily. I mean, there's research that shows that, but it could also say something about gender inequality, for example, which is also linked sometimes to poor long-term development outcomes, for example, in terms of education, in terms of health. So there are different stands to debate, I think, and I've just tried to raise the point and show that there is a debate, but I haven't fully engaged in it. I
Yeah,
think
yeah, but I think
that
it's an interesting point.
there
The
is an interesting point,
because but
and
well,
it,
Botswana is an interesting country,
yeah,
and it's pre-colonial institution. I think we have one of the better papers on the role of pre-colonial institution in stimulating long-term development in Botswana. So this is we're wrapping up now, Jutta. So Jutta, tell us about some of your later academic works. Do you have a book?
we have, well, no, not I, but together with Ellen
Ellen,
Milburn,
yeah.
I have a book on Botswana where we tried, I think it's the first modern economic history of Botswana. It tries to understand how this country, once so poor, became actually one of the growth diamonds in Africa. And it tells a story of rapid economic growth that goes hand in hand with high income inequality. We were the first to sort of establish sort of that link for Botswana, and we show that these structures were put in place during the colonial economy when, and that built actually on the pre-colonial period when cattle incomes of the elite were transferred into high incomes once that economy opened up during the colonial period and started exporting cattle. And that feeded into, and here we see a lot of persistence of pre-colonial institutions to colonial, to post-colonial. We see the elite, the cattle elite that was in power during the pre-colonial and the colonial period also had a big say in how the post-colonial society was organized. And this is actually also a very interesting case, maybe to say something about, does economic growth always go hand in hand with economic development? And what we see in Botswana, this is of course this diamond-driven economy. It is growing rapidly, but it's not transforming in the sense of that it generates a lot of employment opportunity for people outside of the rural sector still. I mean, there is no big industry, for example. There's of course services, but this is often not very productive in terms of labor productivity. So this is really the core. Diamonds are the core of this economy is sort of thriving on or floating on. And I think At the same time, this government has spent money invested in social development. So we see social indicators such as health and education go up, but we do not see that many countries. So there is social development, but there's no economic development in the sense of structural transformation, generating a lot of good labor productive jobs for many people. So I think in that sense, that comes back to a point that we made earlier, or we discussed earlier, that social indicators can sometimes improve, even though not all economic indicators in terms of jobs available improve. And then other work that I'm also working on with Lee and also Jack Payne, James Robertson from Chicago and Rochester on developing a little bit of these African institutions under colonial rule. We think that this is a topic underexplored so far. And as you realize, I like creating new data sets.
Yes, you're a pioneer, Jutta. So Jutta, this is we're going to end the conversation. So bye. But question: do I deserve a free copy of your book?
If you send me your address, I will send you my book.
Yes. Thanks, Jutta. But it was a pleasure to speak to you, and I did my homework.
That is very clear. You did your homework probably better than I did mine.
All right, you're an expert in economics. I'm an expert in the research of Jutta Bolt.
Well, let us just acknowledge each other's skills.
Yes, Jutta.
Thank you for the invitation.
It's a pleasure to speak to you. All right, then bye.
Well-informed questions.
Yes, thanks a lot. Bye.
Okay, bye.